Welcome to The Lead. I'm Erica Hill, in today for Jake Tapper, and we start with the politics lead. President Trump all over the map today on gun control, even questioning his own move, saying he wants to, quote, fill in loopholes on universal background checks, but then moving on to NRA talking points which question that very idea.
But we also have to remember the gun doesn't pull the trigger, a person does. I don't want to take away people's Second Amendment rights. We're talking about background checks. Then all of a sudden, we're talking about let's take everybody's gun away.
This just one day after, according to a source, President Trump told the NRA's executive vice president, Wayne LaPierre, that universal background checks were, quote, off the table. As CNN's Boris Sanchez reports, the president's flip, flop, and flip again come as a new CNN poll shows most Americans want stricter gun control laws in the U.S.
President Donald Trump again shifting his stance on background checks for gun purchases, today insisting that he supports pursuing new gun control legislation.
I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks. We're working with Democrats. We're working with Republicans. We already have very strong background checks.
But sources indicate Trump's support for stricter gun laws has cooled as he repeated NRA talking points to reporters before departing for a veterans event in Kentucky.
It's a slippery slope, and that's what actually your gun owners and a lot of other people are concerned with.
But just a few days ago, Trump also said he didn't believe in the slippery slope.
They think you approve one thing, and that leads to a lot of bad things. I don't agree with that. I think we can do meaningful, very meaningful background checks. I want to see it happen.
The president's comments now also a softer tone from what he said in the days following the mass shootings in Texas and Ohio.
I believe that Mitch, and I can tell you from my standpoint, I would like to see meaningful background checks, and I think something will happen. But I don't want guns in the hands of a lunatic or a maniac. And I think if we do proper background checks, we can prevent that.
The president's softening coincides with recent conversations between White House officials and the NRA, including a recent phone call between Trump and Wayne LaPierre, in which a source says Trump told the NRA head that universal background checks were off the table. LaPierre tweeting on Tuesday, quote, I spoke to the president today. We discussed the best ways to prevent these types of tragedies. Donald Trump is a strong Second Amendment president and supports our right to keep and bear arms. Trump today denying he got into specifics with LaPierre.
I didn't say anything about that. We had a great talk with Wayne yesterday. Didn't say anything about that. We just talked about concepts. Wayne agrees things have to be done also.
Important to point out, we've seen this kind of pattern from President Trump before. You'll recall after the shooting in Parkland, Florida, he taunted lawmakers, suggesting that they were afraid of the NRA and that he was not. He even talked about passing some form of comprehensive gun control legislation back then. After direct talks with the NRA, Erica, the president backed away from that position.
Indeed, he did. Boris, appreciate it. Thank you. As we look at all of this, it's important to point out, too, there's this new CNN poll out today, which finds that 60% of Americans actually favor stricter gun control laws. So it begs the question, and Mehdi, I'll throw this one to you, why it's so hard to move here on an issue that really does have a good amount of support in this country. Is it simply about money and the NRA having the president's ear, or is there more to it?
I think the money in the NRA is definitely a big factor. I think, as Boris just mentioned, he said, oh, you're all afraid of the NRA. With Trump, it's always projection. He says you're afraid of the NRA. Really, he's afraid of the NRA, which is why he initiated the call to the head of the NRA to say, background checks are off the table. Clearly, it's an issue with support. 90% of Republicans support universal background checks. A majority of NRA members, according to one poll, support universal background checks. So, why isn't it happening? Because the NRA doesn't represent its members. It represents gun manufacturers. And Trump also has an issue with his base. It always comes back to his base. There were reports that when he gave that speech last week in New Hampshire and talked about, the gun doesn't pull the trigger, the person does. He loved the applause that got. And he knows, the economy, we're going to talk about it later, is going downhill. He doesn't want to lose those supporters. He sees himself as the Second Amendment guy now, even though he wasn't for most of his life.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think the point about he heard the applause. Mm-hmm.
Classic.
If you look at Donald Trump and who he is from, June 2015 when he announces until now, the one thing that has become very clear is, one, he loves campaign rallies because he hears the applause. And two, he's effectively like a comedian doing a greatest hit, or a band doing a greatest hit show, right? You want to see Hotel California if you go see the Eagles. He is giving them what they like They cheer, he feels validated, and he always says, I don't understand why polling doesn't look good for me. All I do is go around and people cheer for me. That is very much a smart way to understand him. So when you see something added into his rhetoric, like, for example, it's, guns don't pull the trigger, people pull the trigger, or guns don't kill, people don't kill, et cetera. You know what I'm saying? That's when well, he's happy with that line because it got a response. That's who he is.
He knows when something sticks.
Yes.
I think you're right. What's interesting, and you brought this up a little bit, Mehdi, but also Boris touched on this, is that we did hear from him, Mary Catherine, after Parkland, right? Listen, it's time for you, lawmakers, to stand up to the NRA. The reality of where we sit today in August of 2019 is the one person who really has the power to make something happen is the president, because we know no lawmakers are going to push anything through without knowing that the president 100% has their back and that he actually means what he says.
That's why, by the way, McConnell wisely, tactically speaking, was like, well, let's see what happens with the president, because the president will change his mind in 6 days. He wasn't for that idea before. He's not necessarily for this idea now, and that could change in 2 seconds. I will say, as far as getting things through Congress, I think many people misunderstand it when they think that the NRA is the big bad guy and the NRA is the big block here. The reason that Second Amendment supporters win is because they are extremely passionate about this issue, and they are extremely passionate then, now, forevermore. And they vote, and they always act on it, and it does not ebb and flow, unlike the other side, which does ebb and flow based on the news cycle. Now, when it comes to something like universal background checks, one of the reasons I think Democrats do themselves a disservice on the 2020 trail, pushing things like registration and licensing, because it makes people think, well, now you're just saying this stuff out loud. When you're telling me we want to just do this reasonable thing, you're saying, no, you actually want to do this other stuff too. So you lose trust with those voters. Which
really plays into, actually, the NRA's talking points, which the president has picked up about universal background checks, Julie, being a slippery slope. If they are hearing these other things from Democrats, it also sets Democrats up, Joe Biden included, who said, tweeting, once again, President Trump has folded to the NRA, broken his promise to pursue the most modest of gun safety policies. They could also be setting themselves up if they say, we want to do a modest gun safety policy, and they can't get it through because look what they may be stuck with.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there is a risk here of a political risk for both parties on both sides. And it's not just about the money. I think Mary Catherine's right. It is about the political power of some of these voters. And for years and years and years, members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have been afraid of being targeted politically by those people, of being turned out, losing their seats over some of these key votes. And if gun legislation were to, if the president, the irony here is if the president were to be able to bring himself, as with so many other issues, to actually bring up a modest gun safety proposal that polls show that the majority of voters would support, that would put Democrats in a really difficult position. It could potentially be a really hard vote for some of their more moderate Democrats who do not want to go as far as some of the presidential candidates, do not want to go as far as some of their leaders do in imposing gun safety measures. They've taken votes on things that they all do agree on the Democratic side. But the president could make this harder for them politically than he actually is, because he can't seem to bring himself to go on the record and stay on the record in favor of some of these proposals.
That's exactly right. He could. He won't, because he is so enthralled to his base. One other point I want to make, because people do often say, well, Mitch McConnell. Sure. But 2013, 20 kids have been murdered in Newtown, 26 total people dead 3 months earlier. President Barack Obama, a Democrat, has a series of proposals, including expanded background checks and a few other things, that are open to the amendment process in the Senate. He is pushing hard. Who controls the Senate then? 54 Senate Democrats. They're in the majority. Now, they don't get 60 votes for anything. They would have needed 6 Republicans. But the point is, it's not just because, well, Republicans are in control now and they won't do anything. Democrats had opportunities and they had a president pushing hard, and they couldn't get it done. I think it's more, just to add to Mary Catherine's point, I actually think some of this is about the way in which the makeup of the Senate. There is, every state gets 2 votes. Therefore, Wyoming has the same votes as California. So there's going to be a little bit, I think, of a rural bias, more pro-gun. So it's not necessarily representative of the country as a whole. But that's a complicated thing. You want to change that, you got to change the whole Senate.
Right. That requires much more than the time we have for this segment here.